Hello guys, tonight we're diving into the beginnings of everything, the absolute chaos before order existed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where you're listening from. Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the very start, there was only chaos, which was not a person or a god, just nothing, or maybe everything at once. It was a yawning emptiness, infinite and undefined, where no shape or rule applied. Out of this void emerged the first primordial deities, not born in a normal sense, but simply arising, as if the universe had decided it needed some characters to start the story. From this raw, shapeless state came Gaia, the earth, solid and grounding, in contrast to the boundless openness around her, and Uranus, the sky, stretching above her like a vast, watchful canopy. They existed in a kind of balance, though not without tension, because even in these earliest times, beginnings were messy. From the union of earth and sky, other beings were formed, mountains and rivers, and eventually the Titans, the first generation of gods with power, but no clear direction or wisdom. There was something almost unbearably patient about the universe at this stage, letting these figures come into being without immediate oversight, though it didn't take long for conflict to creep in. The Titans were powerful, often overwhelming, and not always aligned with one another or with the intentions of the primordial forces. Time itself, represented by Kronos in some accounts, seemed to stretch differently, almost as if the universe was trying to let the story unfold slowly, allowing every misstep, betrayal, and act of defiance to plant seeds for what would come later. Even in these early myths, there is a strange intimacy in the way the cosmos interacts with its own children, a sense that creation is not just mechanical, but emotional, almost human. Chaos, while absent in form, lingered everywhere, reminding the gods and the world itself that order is always temporary and fragile. Stars, skies, seas, and earth emerged, layered and interacting in a web of influence that would define the lives of gods, titans, and eventually mortals. These first moments were full of potential and vulnerability, an entire cosmos still experimenting with balance, structure, and the relationships that would dominate the stories told for millennia. The universe had no narrator yet, no commentary, but the patterns of conflict, cooperation, and creation were already written into the fabric of existence, waiting for the next chapter to take shape. In these beginnings, there is both wonder and quiet tension, as the stage was being set for the endless interplay of power, desire, and consequence that would follow through the ages. Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky, quickly became the center of an intense, sprawling family saga that would set the tone for generations of gods and mortals alike. Their union produced the Titans, colossal beings with immense strength, and the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants whose very existence suggested that the universe had a sense of scale but not much subtlety. Gaia was nurturing but assertive, deeply connected to the life that grew from her soil, while Uranus was distant, lofty, and sometimes terrifying, hovering over his children in a way that was protective but also controlling. The Titans were a mix of personalities, some cooperative, others rebellious, each shaping the world through their choices and conflicts. Cronus, one of the youngest, quickly emerged as both ambitious and insecure, embodying the volatile nature of the early cosmos. The tension between parent and child escalated, particularly because Uranus, discomforted by the power and size of his children, began to suppress them, hiding or punishing them in ways that were cruel and arbitrary. Gaia, observing this, became frustrated and plotted with her children, sowing the first seeds of rebellion. It was a narrative of power struggles, parental fear, and the consequences of unchecked authority, a theme that would echo endlessly throughout Greek myth. Even at this stage, there was a clear sense that the universe had no interest in fairness, only survival and influence, and the children of earth and sky became unwilling participants in a cosmic game of control. Alliances were formed and broken quickly. Titans plotted against each other, some motivated by fear, others by ambition, all of them navigating the complicated web of obligation and resentment inherited from their progenitors. The physical world responded to these tensions with storms, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions often interpreted as the expressions of divine anger or unrest. In the narrative, Gaia's role was more than maternal. She was the architect of strategy and subtle manipulation, proving that creation itself could be both life-giving and fiercely calculating. Uranus, by contrast, represented rigidity and detachment, a figure whose distance created space for conflict, but also opportunity for the young gods to challenge authority. The family drama established patterns that would recur in countless myths: rebellion, revenge, and the uneasy coexistence of power, ambition, and vulnerability. In this early interplay, the world was shaped not only by the acts of gods, but also by the consequences of neglect, favoritism, and fear, setting a foundation where morality was complex and often secondary to survival. The saga of Gaia, Uranus, and their offspring demonstrated that the divine was deeply human in its emotions and conflicts, making the cosmos feel simultaneously vast, alive, and uncomfortably familiar. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, quickly became the embodiment of both ambition and paranoia, his mind consumed by a prophecy that warned he would be overthrown by one of his own children, a kind of divine anxiety that never really lets up. Driven by this fear, he made the brutal decision to swallow each of his offspring immediately after birth, turning the act of parenting into something grotesque and desperate. As though the weight of destiny had broken any semblance of reason, his wife, Rhea, watched this unfold with mounting dread, feeling the impossible tension between loyalty, love, and survival. The swallowed children, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, were not gone, but trapped within Cronus, existing in a suspended state that was both horrifying and strangely symbolic of the consequences of fear-driven authority. Rhea eventually devised a plan to save her youngest, Zeus, the one child destined to challenge Cronus, by hiding him away in secret and tricking his father with a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. This act of cunning introduced the recurring theme of clever mortals and gods finding loopholes in destiny, showing that wit could rival sheer strength. Zeus's hidden childhood was marked by secrecy, protection, and constant tension, as the world outside remained unaware of the quiet rebellion brewing in the shadows. Meanwhile, Cronus's reign was characterized by rigid control, suspicion, and a constant need to assert dominance, reflecting the volatility of unchecked power. The swallowing of his children was not merely an act of cruelty, but a desperate, almost human response to the anxiety of inevitable change, suggesting that even gods could be trapped by fear. The psychological weight of prophecy and the literal consumption of one's own children created a foundation for myths that explored power, inevitability, and resistance in ways that were both terrifying and deeply relatable. Over time, the tension built to a breaking point as Zeus matured and gathered allies, including the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires, who had been freed by Gaia to aid in the coming conflict. The eventual overthrow of Cronus was not just a violent coup, it was the fulfillment of a cosmic pattern, the passing of the old guard into history, and the emergence of a new order with all the uncertainty, responsibility, and fragile balance that accompanies it. The story of Cronus demonstrated that power, when combined with fear and obsession, becomes self-destructive, and that the cycle of control and rebellion is an enduring aspect of both divine and human history. In these moments, mythology framed timeless truths: that fear can consume even the mighty, that cleverness can protect the vulnerable, and that change, however inevitable, is always fraught with tension and consequence. Zeus emerged from his secret hiding place with a mixture of patience, calculation, and barely contained impatience, aware that his destiny was to overthrow his father and claim authority over both gods and the world below. Unlike Cronus, whose power had been defined by fear, Zeus approached leadership with a combination of strategy and impulsive energy, forging alliances that would become critical in the war against the Titans. The Cyclopes, who had been imprisoned for their strength and craftsmanship, provided him with weapons, most famously the thunderbolt, that were as symbolic as they were practical, marking the shift from inherited power to earned dominance. Zeus's rise was not instantaneous. It involved careful planning, negotiation, and the occasional brutal display of force, revealing that leadership in the mythological sense required both intellect and the willingness to act decisively. Once he engaged Cronus in the conflict known as the Titanomachy, the war became a protracted struggle of strategy and raw power, with entire landscapes shaped by battles that raged for years, leaving the earth scarred and the seas unsettled. His siblings, freed from Cronus's stomach, joined him with their own strengths, creating a coalition of divine forces united by survival, resentment, and the recognition that old hierarchies were fragile. Zeus's personal life, however, was another matter entirely, as his relationships were complex, often impulsive, and marked by his inclination to pursue desire with little regard for consequence, a trait that would generate tension among gods and mortals alike. Even in his consolidation of power, Zeus displayed a pattern that would repeat across generations, favoring some, neglecting others, and intervening in human affairs in ways that were unpredictable and morally ambiguous. His reign over Olympus established new rules, yet left room for chaos to persist, demonstrating that authority, even at the divine level, is always negotiated and never absolute. The contrast between Cronus's paranoid control and Zeus's strategic, yet sometimes reckless leadership underscored a central theme of Greek mythology. Power is inseparable from responsibility, conflict, and the potential for error. Through the consolidation of Olympus under Zeus, the stories conveyed lessons about balance, justice, and the consequences of choices, reflecting both admiration and critique of leadership qualities. Mortals and gods alike would observe these dynamics, experiencing the ripple effects in war, natural disasters, and the caprices of fate, all influenced by Zeus's decisions. Even as he established himself as king, the tension between authority, personal desire, and the unpredictable outcomes of intervention became central to the unfolding narratives, reminding listeners that control is never simple, and that history, divine or mortal, is a continuous interplay of action, consequence, and adaptation. Zeus's story was not just the tale of power. It was a reflection on the complexity of influence, the fragility of order, and the subtle, enduring traces of human-like flaws in those who wielded the greatest authority. Hera, as the wife of Zeus and queen of Olympus, became the embodiment of vigilance, pride, and relentless scrutiny, her presence shaping the dynamics of gods and mortals alike. She was deeply invested in marriage, authority, and the order of Olympus, which meant that Zeus's frequent infidelities were not merely personal affronts, but ongoing challenges to her domain and influence. Hera responded with a careful mix of strategy, subtle manipulation, and occasionally overt punishment, asserting control in ways that were precise and often devastating, though never without leaving her own reputation complex and contested. Her interactions with other gods were marked by a combination of admiration and fear. Even those who respected her might hesitate to cross her, knowing that her memory was long and her responses calculated. Among mortals, Hera could be both protective and vengeful, rewarding loyalty and punishing perceived disrespect, demonstrating that divine justice was deeply intertwined with personal emotion. Her role extended beyond reaction to Zeus's actions. She actively guided, intervened, and influenced events according to her vision of order and propriety, often using the lesser gods as instruments to carry out her will. In this way, Hera's power was subtle, administrative, and enduring, a counterbalance to Zeus's often impulsive decisions, and a reminder that authority could manifest in restraint as much as force. Her myths reveal recurring patterns of jealousy, retribution, and moral calculation, illustrating how the personal and political could not be separated in the divine world. Even within her own family, her influence created tension and shaped the outcomes of major events, from conflicts among gods to the fates of mortals caught in the crossfire. Unlike Zeus's lightning and overwhelming presence, Hera's impact was measured, strategic, and often indirect, yet it carried consequences that could outlast any immediate display of power. Her vigilance extended to ensuring that loyalty and respect were maintained, and her interventions often highlighted the vulnerabilities of gods who underestimated the potency of patience and memory. Over time, her story became intertwined with lessons about the costs of betrayal, the endurance of dignity, and the complexity of relationships governed by both authority and personal investment. Hera was a figure who could inspire both fear and reverence, a goddess whose influence shaped the moral and social frameworks within myth, while reminding both gods and mortals that power was never just about strength. It was about foresight, consistency, and the willingness to act when boundaries were crossed. In all these ways, Hera's presence anchored Olympus in a balance of tension, expectation, and discipline, reinforcing that even divine order required enforcement, attention, and the courage to uphold principles in a world defined by volatility and ambition. Poseidon, ruler of the seas, carried the weight of vast and unpredictable power, his temperament reflected in the ebb and flow of oceans, storms, and earthquakes. Unlike his brother Zeus, whose authority rested in the sky and the structure of Olympus, Poseidon's influence was fluid, extending through every river, harbor, and coastline, a domain both majestic and perilous. He was quick to anger, and when provoked, his wrath reshaped coastlines, capsized ships, and reminded mortals of their vulnerability in the face of divine will. Yet he was not merely destructive. Poseidon could be generous, granting favorable winds, calm waters, or protection to those who honored him properly, demonstrating that power carried duality and that respect, strategy, and timing were essential for survival. His relationships with other gods were tense at times, especially when disputes over territory, influence, or mortals arose, though he could also show loyalty and collaboration when aligned with his siblings or those who proved themselves competent. Poseidon's myths often emphasize unpredictability. A single choice could result in catastrophic flooding or bountiful harvests from the sea, reflecting the fragile balance between human effort and natural forces. His personality mirrored the element he governed, restless, shifting, sometimes destructive, and yet capable of sustaining life. Temples, sacrifices, and rituals marked his importance in the lives of sailors and coastal communities, revealing how deeply intertwined divine favor and survival were in the ancient world. Stories of Poseidon's anger or grudges illustrate the dangers of divine emotions unchecked by reason, and his interventions in mortal affairs frequently set in motion events that shaped entire kingdoms. Despite his power, Poseidon was also subject to hierarchy, often negotiating or contending with Zeus and other Olympians, which highlighted that even immense strength did not guarantee absolute freedom from constraint. In myths, Poseidon's conflicts sometimes arose from pride, rivalry, or perceived slights, reminding listeners that ambition and temper were forces as influential in the divine world as they were among humans. He fathered many offspring, some heroic, others monstrous, extending his presence across the earth and seas, and leaving a legacy that combined both chaos and accomplishment. Poseidon's role in shaping the natural world and human experience reinforced the concept that divine forces were intimately linked with everyday life, that survival depended on understanding these forces, and that respect, humility, and careful navigation, literal and metaphorical, were essential. In all of this, Poseidon embodied the tension between unpredictability and power, between the sustenance of life and its sudden disruption, demonstrating that even gods were defined as much by temperament as by authority. His presence served as a reminder that the natural world could never be fully mastered, and that reverence for forces beyond human control was both practical and necessary, shaping the foundation of countless myths, rituals, and legends in the process. Hades, ruler of the underworld, governed a realm unseen yet essential, a space where the living rarely ventured, but where every soul ultimately arrived. Unlike Zeus, who wielded power visibly over sky and law, or Poseidon, whose moods shaped oceans, Hades' influence was subtle, omnipresent, and often misunderstood. He did not seek attention or admiration, preferring the solemn rhythms of his domain. The underworld was organized with strict rules and hierarchies, populated by spirits, judges, and occasional heroes, each subject to Hades' measured authority. He was wealthy, not just in gold and precious minerals of the earth, but in knowledge, patience, and control, a ruler whose presence ensured balance between life and death. Mortals feared him, sometimes with reason, because contact with his realm meant permanence, but he was not capricious or cruel for amusement. His judgments reflected the structure and inevitability of mortality itself. Myths surrounding Hades often emphasize his negotiation with circumstances, as when he took Persephone to the underworld, an act that was complex in intention and consequence, blending desire, politics, and the inexorable rhythms of life and death. Though he remained largely apart from the squabbles of Olympus, his influence reached everywhere, as death is universal and unavoidable, touching the lives of gods and mortals alike. The underworld, divided into regions like the Elysian Fields and Tartarus, reflected Hades' organization, his balance between reward and punishment, and the permanence of choice and action. Despite his reputation, Hades demonstrated loyalty and subtle compassion, particularly in his relationships with those who entered his realm willingly or whose fates were intertwined with his decisions. His isolation from the rest of Olympus was not punishment, but preference, a deliberate detachment that allowed him to rule with clarity, free from the personal conflicts and politics that defined his siblings. Even his interactions with mortals were measured, often indirect, mediated through omens, heroes, or intermediaries, highlighting that influence can be absolute without constant display. Hades' mythic presence reinforced the inevitability of consequence, the permanence of mortality, and the necessity of respecting boundaries that cannot be crossed without risk. His wealth, power, and authority were constant and unyielding, yet the subtlety of his influence made it both feared and respected, a reminder that the most profound forces are not always those most visible. In controlling the underworld, Hades maintained equilibrium across the cosmos, ensuring that life, death, and the cycles of existence persisted uninterrupted, shaping both divine and human experience through quiet, consistent authority rather than spectacle or force. His presence underscored a truth central to Greek mythology, that control, when exercised without ego or excess, can be more enduring than might or spectacle, and that even the unseen has the power to govern destinies. Athena, born fully grown and armored from the head of Zeus, immediately established herself as a figure of wisdom, strategy, and controlled authority, a goddess whose presence combined intellect with precision in ways that even other Olympians found difficult to match. From her first moments, she demonstrated that thought could rival strength, solving problems, mediating conflicts, and guiding both gods and mortals with clarity that was at once practical and intimidating. Athena became associated with war, not in the chaotic, destructive way of Ares, but through strategy, defense, and the protection of cities, particularly Athens, which reflected her patronage and careful attention to civic life. Her interactions with mortals often involved teaching, offering guidance to heroes like Odysseus and Perseus, providing tools, tactics, or insight that could tip the balance between success and failure. Unlike other gods, Athena rarely acted out of jealousy, desire, or emotion. Her motivations were measured, logical, and consistent, though she could be formidable in her opposition to those who misused power or offended her principles. Myths show her intervening in battles, disputes, and competitions with the precision of someone who understood both the immediate stakes and the long-term consequences of action, revealing a depth of foresight that was unusual even among immortals. She maintained a duality, embodying both nurturing intelligence and fierce assertiveness, demonstrating that wisdom often carries the weight of responsibility and moral judgment. Athena's influence extended beyond warfare to arts, crafts, and law, marking her as a goddess of civilization itself, whose guidance encouraged structure, discipline, and achievement. She could outthink rivals, manipulate circumstances without overt force, and still command respect and fear, illustrating that power could be subtle, enduring, and strategic rather than loud or impulsive. Mortals and gods alike recognized her authority, often turning to her in moments of uncertainty, knowing that her insight was both dependable and uncompromising. Athena's existence also reflected the complexity of divine origin, emerging not from a traditional birth, but directly from Zeus's mind, symbolizing intellect as a creative and generative force. Her interventions often carried lessons that planning matters more than brute strength, that foresight can prevent unnecessary destruction, and that the application of knowledge is itself a form of influence. Even her rivalries, such as those with Poseidon over Athens or with other figures who challenged her principles, were marked by calculation rather than chaos, reinforcing the idea that wisdom requires consistency, patience, and sometimes severity. Through Athena, Greek mythology emphasized that intellect, strategy, and moral guidance were as essential to existence as power or desire, and that the outcomes of both mortal and divine actions often hinged on insight, preparation, and the capacity to act with both strength and thoughtfulness. Apollo and Artemis, twin children of Zeus and Leto, represented complementary forces, each reflecting aspects of light, discipline, and the natural order, yet their personalities and spheres of influence often brought them into tension with each other and with those around them. Apollo, associated with the sun, music, prophecy, and healing, embodied clarity, rationality, and the visible structures of culture, bringing guidance and illumination both literally and metaphorically, while also carrying an expectation of perfection that could be harsh on mortals and gods alike. Artemis, connected with the moon, hunting, wilderness, and chastity, embraced independence, precision, and protection of the vulnerable, often operating outside the urban order her brother upheld, her influence emphasizing freedom, instinct, and the untamed rhythms of life. Their interactions reflected the balance of symmetry and opposition. Apollo's desire for order and recognition could clash with Artemis's insistence on autonomy and moral independence, creating stories that explored sibling rivalry, loyalty, and the consequences of pride or misjudgment. Both engaged with mortals selectively, offering protection, punishment, or gifts according to perceived virtue or disrespect, showing that divine favor was conditional, nuanced, and not subject to human expectations of fairness. Myths recount their interventions in warfare, competitions, and human affairs, illustrating how the twins exercised power differently. Apollo with structured guidance and articulate influence, Artemis through decisive, often solitary action that enforced her principles directly. Their dynamic also highlighted recurring patterns in Greek myth: the interplay of complementary forces, the consequences of hubris, and the tension between control and freedom. Both were skilled archers, yet their skills carried distinct symbolism. Apollo's precision often represented foresight and clarity, while Artemis's marksmanship reflected instinct, decisiveness, and respect for boundaries. Through their myths, the twins taught lessons about responsibility, the limits of authority, and the consequences of intrusion into spaces governed by principle, whether mortal or divine. Even in competition or conflict, Apollo and Artemis often acted with a sense of purpose, demonstrating that power was most effective when aligned with skill, foresight, and ethical restraint. Mortals learned from their examples that success and protection were intertwined with respect, attention, and discipline, while transgressions could result in swift and uncompromising responses. Together, the twins embodied the natural and cultural order, bridging sunlight and moonlight, urban and wild, guidance and independence, illustrating that divine influence was multifaceted and that human experience, when observed by gods, required careful navigation. Their stories emphasized the importance of balance, consistency, and moral alignment in a universe where divine forces operated with autonomy, reflecting patterns of power, consequence, and interconnectedness that would shape generations of heroes and mortals alike. Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire, wielded influence that was subtle yet pervasive, shaping both gods and mortals through attraction, persuasion, and the unavoidable power of emotion. Born, according to some myths, from sea foam, she carried an aura of allure that was at once magnetic and disruptive, demonstrating that influence could be exercised without overt force, yet still reshape kingdoms, families, and individual destinies. Her presence in myths often triggered events that were both personal and monumental: wars over beauty, rivalries sparked by jealousy, and alliances forged or broken through desire, showing that emotion could operate as effectively as strength or strategy. Aphrodite's relationships with gods and mortals were complex. She could inspire devotion and loyalty, yet equally provoke resentment and conflict, reflecting the double-edged nature of attraction and the consequences of unchecked desire. Mortals often sought her favor, understanding that romantic and aesthetic appeal had tangible impacts on social standing, political alliances, and personal survival. Within the pantheon, her interventions sometimes clashed with other gods' agendas, especially those of Athena or Hera, whose domains emphasized intellect, order, and morality, creating narratives where beauty and desire disrupted existing structures. Myths recount that her influence was not limited to romance or eroticism. It extended into cultural expression, art, and diplomacy, reminding mortals and gods alike that persuasion and perception could wield power equal to that of strength or prophecy. Aphrodite's stories emphasize the consequences of underestimating subtle forces. Kingdoms could fall, conflicts could erupt, and heroes could be both aided and undone by her interventions. Her own relationships, whether with Ares, mortals, or other gods, demonstrated the complexities of loyalty, attraction, and manipulation, highlighting that charm alone could redirect the course of events. Beyond personal interactions, Aphrodite embodied a broader principle that desire, beauty, and emotional resonance shape human and divine behavior in ways that are unavoidable, pervasive, and sometimes uncontrollable. Through her myths, listeners learn that the intangible, beauty, persuasion, longing, can carry consequences as real as any weapon or strategy, influencing choices, inspiring ambition, and provoking both cooperation and conflict. Aphrodite's presence also underscored the interconnectedness of the divine and mortal realms. What she influenced in one domain often resonated across the other, demonstrating the ripple effect of emotional and aesthetic power. Her role illustrates that control over hearts, attention, and perception can be as significant as command over armies, natural forces, or moral authority, and that understanding these subtleties is crucial for survival, diplomacy, and achievement in both human and divine spheres. In all her appearances, Aphrodite reinforced that influence is multidimensional, that beauty and emotion have enduring power, and that even the strongest can be redirected by forces beyond logic or convention. The heroes of Greek mythology, mortals born into danger, destiny, or divine favor, inhabited a world shaped as much by God's whims as by their own choices, a realm where courage, cunning, and resilience were constantly tested. Figures like Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus embodied extremes of strength, intellect, and moral ambiguity, each navigating a landscape defined by monsters, curses, and impossible tasks that blurred the line between human and divine. Heracles, for instance, undertook the famous 12 labors not merely as punishment, but as a form of existential endurance, proving that heroism often demanded endurance against overwhelming odds, both physical and psychological. Perseus faced Medusa, a threat not just of death, but of transformation, learning that cleverness, preparation, and timely assistance from gods like Athena and Hermes could outweigh brute force, and that mortal initiative was often inseparable from divine influence. Theseus ventured into labyrinths and political intrigue, negotiating power, identity, and survival in ways that reflected the precariousness of human agency when gods intervened unpredictably. Heroes were often caught between duty and desire, morality and necessity, forced to make decisions with incomplete information, all while under scrutiny from immortals whose perspectives were shaped by pride, jealousy, or curiosity. Their successes and failures were magnified by the cosmic stakes. One mistake could unleash monsters, curse entire cities, or provoke a god's wrath, highlighting the constant tension between effort and consequence. Mortals were also vehicles for demonstrating recurring patterns, ambition, resilience, and the impact of choices in worlds beyond their full comprehension. Even seemingly straightforward quests carried layers of symbolic meaning, reflecting lessons about courage, ethics, and the complex interplay between fate and free will. Heroes' interactions with divine figures often required negotiation, humility, or cunning, revealing that mortal power was rarely absolute, but could be significant when paired with insight, bravery, or strategic alliances. Their exploits shaped culture, geography, and history, leaving behind enduring stories of triumph, failure, and the cost of human action under divine scrutiny. Myths of heroism emphasize that personal growth, resilience, and ingenuity matter even when circumstances feel overwhelming or controlled by external forces, offering a framework for understanding the relationship between human ambition and cosmic order. The narratives of Heracles, Perseus, and others illustrate that heroism is not simply about defeating monsters, but about navigating a web of responsibility, risk, and morality, with outcomes that reverberate far beyond the individual. In this way, Greek myths present heroes as both mirrors and instruments of the world around them, flawed, ambitious, and courageous beings whose decisions carry consequences for themselves, their societies, and even the divine, reminding listeners that survival and achievement demand awareness, adaptability, and a recognition of forces larger than oneself. The legacy of Greek myths persisted long after the events of gods and heroes, weaving into art, culture, and philosophy in ways that revealed their enduring relevance. Stories of conflict, desire, strategy, and consequence became frameworks for understanding human nature, offering models of virtue, cautionary tales, and reflections on power, ambition, and morality. The myths demonstrated that divine and mortal actions were deeply intertwined, that decisions carried consequences beyond immediate perception, and that life's unpredictability required awareness, skill, and sometimes compromise. Even as the myths were retold across generations, they retained their capacity to shock, inspire, and provoke thought, suggesting that narrative was not merely entertainment, but a medium for social, ethical, and psychological exploration. Temples, art, and ritual reinforced the gods' presence in everyday life, reminding mortals that stories were lived experiences, shaping expectations, behaviors, and belief systems. Heroes' exploits became symbols of perseverance and ingenuity, their successes and failures mirrored in human ambition and limitations. The recurring motifs of hubris, vengeance, cleverness, and fate highlighted patterns that could guide or warn, bridging the divine and the human through example and reflection. These stories also emphasized relational dynamics, showing that loyalty, betrayal, love, and ambition were forces that transcended mortality, structuring society and morality alike. The resonance of myth extended into philosophy and literature, influencing thought on ethics, governance, and the nature of existence itself. In the repetition and reinterpretation of these myths, each generation found new meaning, adapting the lessons of Olympus to changing contexts while maintaining the core tension between power, responsibility, and consequence. Greek mythology's legacy was therefore both practical and symbolic, reflecting enduring truths about human and divine experience, the fragility of order, and the persistence of narrative as a tool for understanding life. Greek mythology influenced not only storytelling, but also the moral and cultural frameworks of civilizations that followed, shaping ideas about virtue, justice, and the consequences of action. Myths served as mirrors of human behavior, reflecting the complexity of decision-making, the persistence of ambition, and the inevitable interplay between desire and restraint. Gods, heroes, and mortals acted in ways that highlighted both admirable traits and fatal flaws, creating a landscape where lessons were embedded in narrative rather than dictated by law or philosophy. These stories guided societies in understanding leadership, loyalty, and the consequences of overreaching ambition, emphasizing that choices, whether made in moments of impulse or careful calculation, reverberated beyond the individual. The cyclical nature of myth, where one generation's arrogance or cleverness led to another's challenge or adaptation, illustrated a principle of historical continuity, showing that power, error, and resilience were inseparable from existence. Even artistic representation, from sculpture to pottery, carried moral and symbolic weight, depicting gods and heroes in ways that reminded observers of both their own potential and limitations. Festivals, rituals, and religious observances reinforce the myth's lessons, connecting the divine with daily life, survival, and the natural world, emphasizing respect, attention, and consequence. Mortals learn through observation and participation that the favor of gods could be fleeting, that morality could be complex, and that understanding forces beyond oneself was essential for navigating life. The stories also provided a framework for interpreting natural phenomena, human emotion, and social dynamics, blending imagination with instruction in ways that were compelling, enduring, and psychologically resonant. By engaging with these narratives, civilizations reinforced values such as courage, prudence, and accountability, while also acknowledging the unpredictability of life and the inevitability of death, fate, and change. Heroes and their exploits offered cautionary examples as well as aspirational models, reminding listeners that resilience, strategy, and reflection were essential qualities in the face of challenges that could be both human and divine. Greek mythology, in its combination of drama, morality, and consequence, created a shared language of understanding and storytelling, providing a lens through which generations could explore ethics, behavior, and the human condition without formalized codification. In this way, myth functioned as both cultural glue and moral compass, a system of knowledge embedded in story that allowed civilizations to reflect on themselves, their leaders, and the interplay between individual agency and forces beyond control, ensuring that lessons of Olympus remained relevant long after the original tales were first told. Mortals and societies interpreted divine actions, heroic exploits, and the consequences of hubris as reflections of their own lives, creating a dialogue between narrative and experience that transcended time. The myths illustrated the interplay between power and responsibility, showing that even beings with extraordinary strength or insight could act destructively when unchecked, and that wisdom often required restraint and reflection. Gods and heroes were mirrors of human nature, revealing both potential and limitation, and inviting contemplation of ethical dilemmas, justice, and moral complexity. Storytelling became a method of encoding knowledge, memory, and social norms, with each retelling preserving the tension between action, consequence, and interpretation. Even natural phenomena were explained through myth, from earthquakes and storms to the change of seasons, embedding observation into narrative and demonstrating that understanding the environment was inseparable from human experience. Artists, philosophers, and writers drew from these tales, translating lessons into sculpture, poetry, and drama, reinforcing their resonance across centuries. The influence of myth extended into civic and religious life, guiding festivals, rituals, and practices that reinforced community cohesion, moral reflection, and acknowledgement of forces beyond human control. Heroes and their journeys became templates for personal and societal aspiration, illustrating that resilience, courage, intelligence, and prudence were necessary for navigating challenges that were simultaneously practical, symbolic, and existential. Myths provided cautionary examples alongside aspirational models, emphasizing that failure and success were both instructive and that moral discernment often determined outcomes as much as strength or skill. By exploring relationships between gods and mortals, humans and nature, ambition and consequence, the stories maintained relevance across generations, offering insight into psychology, leadership, and social dynamics without didactic instruction. The adaptability of these myths allowed them to remain alive in cultural memory, interpreted differently depending on context, audience, and purpose, yet preserving core patterns of human and divine interaction. Even today, they continue to influence literature, art, philosophy, and entertainment, reflecting the enduring human fascination with power, morality, and narrative structure. The persistence of Greek mythology demonstrates that stories are not merely entertainment, but vital tools for understanding ourselves, our societies, and the unpredictable forces that shape life, offering guidance and reflection across centuries in ways that are intuitive, emotionally resonant, and intellectually compelling. Ultimately, Greek mythology left a legacy that transcended the stories themselves, becoming a lens through which generations have interpreted human nature, the cosmos, and the delicate relationship between action and consequence. The myths demonstrated patterns. Power could corrupt, wisdom could guide, and personal decisions resonated far beyond immediate perception, a framework that remained relevant as societies evolved. Mortals learned from the examples of heroes and the consequences of hubris, understanding that courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking could overcome obstacles, but that recklessness or arrogance could destroy even the strongest. Divine influence illustrated that forces beyond human control are constant, yet insight, preparation, and ethical awareness allowed humans to navigate uncertainty, emphasizing the interplay of freedom and limitation. Over centuries, these myths informed art, philosophy, literature, and ritual, reinforcing cultural memory and moral reflection, while also providing shared narratives that connected communities, generations, and even civilizations. Heroes' journeys became metaphors for personal and societal growth, and God's interventions underscored the limits of control, illustrating that life's complexity often exceeds human comprehension, yet can be approached with wisdom, courage, and resilience. The stories also highlighted relational dynamics, showing that loyalty, betrayal, desire, and ambition drive outcomes as much as brute strength or divine power, offering lessons about negotiation, foresight, and responsibility. Even when retold or reinterpreted, the core themes persisted, revealing that human fascination with ethics, mortality, and consequence is enduring, and that narrative serves as a bridge between observation and understanding. The myth's endurance suggests that storytelling itself is a fundamental tool for grappling with uncertainty, teaching lessons, and exploring the spectrum of human and divine experience, providing insight that is simultaneously practical, symbolic, and reflective. In the end, Greek mythology is not simply a collection of fantastical tales, but a cultural system that preserved knowledge, conveyed morality, and offered models of behavior that are recognizable, instructive, and emotionally resonant across time. Its relevance lies in its ability to reflect the human condition, revealing that even in worlds ruled by immortal beings, patterns of ambition, error, courage, and consequence remain familiar, guiding, warning, and inspiring those who listen. Through gods, heroes, and mortals, the myths continue to shape understanding, imagination, and culture, leaving a timeless imprint on the way humanity perceives itself, its choices, and the forces that govern existence. Vlad III had not begun life as a legend or a monster. He had begun as a political bargaining chip, which was far less glamorous and far more common in 15th century Eastern Europe. Born in 1431 in the Transylvanian town of Sighișoara, he entered a region permanently stuck between ambitious empires. His father, Vlad II Dracul, had joined the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric club dedicated to defending Christianity against the Ottoman Empire. It sounded heroic, and perhaps it was, but it also meant constant maneuvering. Wallachia, the principality the family ruled, sat like an anxious middle child between Hungary and the Ottomans. Survival required flexibility, flattery, and occasionally surrendering one's own sons as collateral. In 1442, young Vlad and his brother Radu were handed over to the Ottoman court as hostages to guarantee their father's loyalty. it was presented as diplomacy. In practice, it was an extended, high-stakes babysitting arrangement under the watchful eye of Sultan Murad II. The boys were educated in languages, warfare, and court etiquette. They learned Turkish, studied strategy, and observed how an empire actually functioned. Vlad proved intelligent, intense, and stubbornly proud. He did not blend in. He absorbed everything, but he did not soften. The Ottoman court was orderly and disciplined, and it operated with a scale of authority that Wallachia could barely imagine. For a boy raised in a precarious principality, that contrast left an impression. Meanwhile, back home, alliances shifted like loose floorboards. In 1447, Vlad II Tranquil was overthrown and killed by rival nobles, the boyars, with Hungarian backing. Shortly afterward, Vlad's older brother Mircea was captured and buried alive. News of this reached the hostage princes. For Radu, the Ottoman world increasingly felt stable. For Vlad, it became a furnace. He was released in 1448, briefly supported by the Ottomans to claim the Wallachian throne after his father's death. It was a short-lived installment. He ruled for mere weeks before being pushed out. Still, the experience had changed him. He had witnessed betrayal, imperial discipline, and the brutal calculus of power before adulthood. Hostage childhood did not make him uniquely cruel, but it did teach him that mercy rarely survived contact with ambition. By the time he left Ottoman custody, he carried more than memories. He carried a very clear understanding that fear, properly managed, might be the only reliable currency in a region allergic to stability. After that brief and forgettable first attempt at ruling in 1448, Vlad did not immediately reclaim power. He drifted through exile like a prince without a stage. Wallachia did not hand out second chances easily. The throne passed to Vladislav II, a rival backed by Hungary, while Vlad moved between courts in Moldavia and Transylvania, watching, waiting, and learning who could be bought, who could be intimidated, and who needed to be removed entirely. The region functioned less like a kingdom and more like a chessboard, constantly kicked over mid-game. Alliances rarely lasted longer than a season. By 1456, circumstances shifted again. Hungary's regent, John Hunyadi, launched a major campaign against the Ottomans. Vlad saw an opening and seized it with sharp timing. He returned to Wallachia, confronted Vladislav II, and defeated him in combat. Chroniclers claimed the two met in single combat before Vladislav was killed, a detail that may have been embellished but fit the mood of the moment. Vlad took the throne for the second time, and this time he intended to stay. Wallachia's greatest internal problem lay not with foreign empires, but with its own nobility. The boyars had engineered his father's downfall and his brother's death. They were powerful landowners who shifted loyalty whenever convenient. Vlad did not trust them, and trust was not something he felt compelled to experiment with. Early in his reign, he invited many leading boyars to an Easter feast. It sounded ceremonial and even conciliatory. Instead, he had them arrested. Older nobles were reportedly impaled on the spot. Younger ones were forced into labor-building Poenari Castle high in the Carpathian Mountains. Whether every detail was accurate or later exaggerated, the purge was real. Vlad aimed to break the cycle of aristocratic sabotage by demonstrating that noble blood did not grant immunity. He reorganized administration, centralized authority, and insisted on strict obedience. Theft was punished severely. Corruption was treated as treason. Travelers later told stories of a golden cup left by a well in Targovishte that no one dared steal. The message was blunt. Order would exist, or consequences would follow. Foreign policy required equal calculation. Wallachia still owed tribute to the Ottoman Empire, but Vlad resented paying it. He delayed payments, tested boundaries, and fortified towns. His rule was not chaotic in his own eyes, it was corrective. He had seen what weakness invited. Now he preferred clarity. Authority flowed downward, and disloyalty flowed nowhere. By the early 1460s, Vlad's relationship with the Ottoman Empire had shifted from tense compliance to open defiance. Tribute payments stopped. Envoys were treated not as honored diplomats, but as irritations. One oft-repeated account described Ottoman ambassadors who refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing custom. Vlad reportedly solved the disagreement by having the turbans nailed to their heads. Whether embroidered by hostile pamphleteers or rooted in truth, the story circulated widely, and its survival said something about the atmosphere he cultivated. Formalities mattered, but obedience mattered more. In 1461, he launched a campaign south of the Danube into Ottoman-controlled territory, attacking garrisons and burning settlements. It was a calculated provocation. He wanted to signal that Wallachia would not quietly function as a revenue stream. Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from conquering Constantinople, did not appreciate provincial insubordination. In 1462, the Sultan marched north with a substantial army to remove him. Vlad did not meet force with conventional battle lines. He met it with disruption. He ordered wells poisoned, fields destroyed, livestock driven away. The strategy was scorched earth without apology. He understood that Wallachia could not match Ottoman numbers, so he focused on attrition and confusion. Then came the night attack at Targoviste in June 1462. Under cover of darkness, Vlad led a surprise assault on the Ottoman camp, aiming directly for the Sultan's tent. Disguised in Turkish dress, Wallachian soldiers cut through sections of the encampment. Fires spread, shouting erupted, and the operation nearly reached Mehmed himself before misidentification caused the strike to miss its primary target. The raid did not kill the Sultan, but it unsettled him. Retreating deeper into Wallachia, the Ottoman army encountered a spectacle that would echo through European imagination. Outside Targoviste stood what later chroniclers called a forest of impaled bodies, thousands of prisoners mounted on stakes in varying heights, arranged with grim precision. Some estimates exaggerated the numbers dramatically, yet contemporary sources agreed the display was vast. The intention was unmistakable, terror as architecture. It was not random cruelty in his framing. It was psychological warfare staged at scale. Mehmed reportedly withdrew soon after, citing supply strain and the hostility of the landscape. Vlad had not defeated the empire outright, but he had made invasion feel costly. In a region where reputation functioned as a shield, he was crafting his carefully. When Mehmed II advanced toward Targoviste in 1462, he expected resistance, perhaps even battle, but not spectacle arranged with theatrical deliberation. The approach to the capital revealed what later writers described as a vast field of impaled corpses. Prisoners, soldiers, criminals, and captured opponents stood suspended on stakes driven through their bodies and planted upright in the ground. Heights varied, spacing appeared intentional, and the scene stretched across the plain in rows. Numbers differed wildly in sources, ranging from several thousand to far more, though medieval chroniclers were not known for conservative arithmetic. What remained consistent was the effect. The display functioned as a message carved into flesh. Invasion would not be tidy. Vlad understood fear not as chaos but as an instrument. He curated it. Impalement itself was not unique to him. It existed in multiple cultures as a severe punishment, yet he employed it with frequency and visibility that transformed method into signature. The process was engineered for prolonged suffering, a stake inserted carefully to avoid immediate death. It was public, slow, and unforgettable. Foreign observers recoiled, and neighboring rulers took note. The Ottoman army, already strained by supply issues and harassment tactics, found morale fraying in the face of this landscape. Mehmed reportedly remarked that it was difficult to deprive such a man of his country. Whether apocryphal or authentic, the quote captured a begrudging recognition. Still, terror could not solve everything. Internal loyalty wavered. Some boyars, never fully reconciled to Vlad's severity, shifted allegiance to his brother Radu, who had remained in Ottoman favor and advanced with the invading forces. Radu promised stability and less spectacle. For nobles exhausted by constant brinkmanship, that offer held appeal. Vlad's strategy relied on unity behind his authority, yet his governance had left limited room for affection. As Ottoman pressure mounted and support eroded, he withdrew toward Transylvania, seeking assistance from Hungary's king Matthias Corvinus. He expected alliance based on shared Christian opposition to the Ottomans. Instead, political convenience intervened. Matthias arrested him in late 1462, reportedly using forged letters that suggested Vlad had negotiated with the Ottomans. The accusation simplified Hungarian diplomacy. Imprisoning Vlad avoided open conflict while preserving image. Thus the ruler, who had filled fields with warnings, found himself confined in a foreign court. The forest of corpses lingered in memory, retold in pamphlets and diplomatic reports. It marked the peak of his notoriety and the beginning of his vulnerability. Fear had carried him far, but it had not insulated him from isolation. Word count 450. Awaiting continue. Vlad's imprisonment under King Matthias Corvinus did not resemble a dungeon in the dramatic sense, though it was captivity nonetheless. Held in Hungary for roughly 12 years, beginning in 1462, he existed in a strange political limbo. Officially, he had been accused of treachery against Christendom, an allegation supported by conveniently surfaced letters claiming he sought reconciliation with the Ottomans. Historians later questioned the authenticity of those documents, suspecting they were crafted to justify removing an inconvenient ally. Matthias benefited from presenting himself as defender of Europe without committing fully to Vlad's unpredictable methods. Confinement neutralized the problem neatly. During these years, printed pamphlets circulated in German-speaking regions depicting Vlad as a sadistic tyrant who dined among impaled victims and delighted in elaborate cruelty. The invention of the printing press had recently amplified the speed at which such stories traveled. Sensational accounts sold well. Saxon merchants from Transylvania who had clashed with Vlad over trade privileges and punitive campaigns found opportunity in exaggeration. Their narratives emphasized brutality while omitting context. Meanwhile, in Slavic lands, alternative tales portrayed him as a stern but just ruler who punished corruption and defended sovereignty. Reputation fractured along political lines. Vlad himself adapted. Records suggested he converted to Catholicism during captivity, likely as a strategic decision rather than spiritual revelation. Over time, his conditions eased. He married Ilona Szilágyi, a relative of Matthias, integrating into Hungarian nobility. The former warlord became a courtly figure, though never entirely domesticated. His years in confinement were less about reflection and more about recalibration. He observed shifting alliances, Ottoman advances, and Hungarian calculations. Europe continued its tense standoff with Mehmed's expanding empire. By the mid-1470s, circumstances changed again. Stephen III of Moldavia, Vlad's cousin, and a formidable ruler in his own right, sought support against Ottoman pressure. Matthias reconsidered the usefulness of his captive. In 1475, Vlad was released and restored to a position of military command. The narrative pivoted from prisoner to potential asset. Years of enforced stillness had not erased his ambition. They had simply compressed it. He returned to regional politics older, experienced, and carrying a reputation that had grown independently of his actions. Stories had multiplied in his absence, shaping him into something larger and darker than the man confined behind Hungarian walls. When he prepared to reclaim Wallachia once more, he did so aware that legend now preceded him. That knowledge was not a burden. It was leverage waiting to be tested again. In 1476, Vlad moved once more toward Wallachia, supported by Hungarian and Moldavian forces. The regional map had shifted repeatedly during his absence. Rulers had come and gone, loyalties rearranged themselves, and Ottoman influence pressed steadily northward. Basarab, Lajota, an Ottoman-backed claimant, occupied the throne. For Vlad, reclaiming power was no longer about dramatic gestures. It was about relevance. With Stephen III of Moldavia applying pressure from one direction, and Hungarian interests aligning temporarily with his return, he advanced into Wallachian territory and succeeded in driving Basarab out. By late 1476, Vlad III sat on the throne for the third time. It was a brief restoration, more fragile than his earlier reign. The land he inherited was exhausted by years of shifting rulers and foreign campaigns. Nobles weighed their options carefully, calculating which allegiance would outlast the season. Vlad, older and arguably more measured, still ruled with severity. There was no public reinvention of his methods. Authority remained centralized, punishments remained harsh, and loyalty was expected rather than negotiated. Yet circumstances offered little room for consolidation. Ottoman forces regrouped quickly. Basarab returned with support, and the balance tipped again. Sometime in December 1476, Vlad died in battle near Bucharest, though accounts differed on the exact location and manner. Some sources claimed he was killed fighting Ottoman troops. Others suggested he fell victim to treachery, mistaken for an enemy in the confusion of combat. His body was reportedly decapitated and his head sent to Constantinople as proof of his death. Sultan Mehmed II displayed it publicly, a final statement that even the most defiant provincial ruler could be subdued. The torso's burial site remained uncertain. Later tradition associated his grave with the monastery at Snagov, though archaeological investigations produced ambiguous results. His death did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived as many medieval deaths did, amid mud, steel, and abrupt silence. The third reign had lasted only weeks. If his life had followed a pattern, it was one of ascent, expulsion, and return, each cycle shorter and more precarious. He left behind a principality still vulnerable and a reputation already untethered from precise fact. The man who had weaponized fear could not outmaneuver mortality. His story closed not with triumph or dramatic reckoning, but with a severed head carried south and a throne once again vacant. After his death, Vlad did not immediately settle into obscurity. Instead, his image drifted across Europe in ink and rumor, shaped less by eyewitness accuracy and more by appetite for sensation. German pamphlets continued to circulate, cataloging episodes of cruelty in vivid, sometimes lurid detail. They described banquets among the dying, meticulous punishments for minor infractions, and elaborate demonstrations of suffering. Whether each episode occurred exactly as printed mattered less than the cumulative effect. Readers encountered a ruler rendered almost theatrical in savagery. These accounts appeared at a moment when print culture was new enough to feel electric. Stories traveled farther and faster than before, and nuance rarely kept pace. In contrast, Slavic chronicles preserved a different tone. There, he appeared as a stern defender of order, a prince who punished thieves without hesitation and resisted Ottoman domination with rare intensity. The divergence revealed how narrative often followed interest. Saxon merchants in Transylvania had suffered under his economic restrictions and retaliatory raids. Their hostility colored the German texts. Orthodox writers concerned with sovereignty and external threat framed him as a bulwark. History split into parallel portraits. Meanwhile, in Wallachia itself, political life resumed with familiar instability. Successors ruled under varying degrees of Ottoman oversight. Vlad's name lingered not as an administrative blueprint, but as a cautionary reference. His severity became shorthand in regional memory. Oral tradition simplified him, smoothing contradictions into something more symbolic. The details of policy faded, the spectacle endured. Even the uncertainty surrounding his burial contributed to mystique. Legends attached themselves to monasteries and lakes, to graves that may or may not have held his remains. Absence invited imagination. By the late 15th century, he existed simultaneously as former prince and cautionary exemplar. His life had unfolded within the tight constraints of frontier politics, yet its retelling expanded far beyond that context. What began as strategies of intimidation became stories detached from their immediate purpose. The man who once calculated terror as a practical instrument now occupied a space where terror was aesthetic, almost allegorical. Memory reshaped him in increments, emphasizing extremes and discarding moderation. He had governed a small principality under relentless pressure, but posterity preferred sharper edges. As decades passed, his biography thinned into episodes, each retold with slight adjustment. In that slow transformation, Vlad ceased to be only a historical actor. He became material. Centuries later, the historical Vlad III drifted into an entirely different narrative when 19th century imagination encountered his name. In 1897, Irish writer Bram Stoker published Dracula, selecting the name Dracula after encountering references to Vlad Dracul and his son in historical texts. Stoker borrowed the name's resonance, not the biography. His fictional count became a Transylvanian vampire aristocrat, elegant and predatory, inhabiting a Gothic landscape of superstition and fog. The real Vlad had never slept in coffins or dissolved into mist. He had governed a tense border state and navigated power with calculated severity. Yet the novel fused fragments of regional history with Victorian anxieties about invasion, disease, and foreignness. Over time, fiction overshadowed record. Tourists visited castles loosely associated with him, often architecturally unrelated. Folklore, cinema, and popular culture layered additional traits onto the composite figure. Capes appeared, fangs followed. The historical prince receded behind theatrical reinvention. Scholars continued to sift documents, comparing Ottoman chronicles, Hungarian records, and local accounts to approximate a balanced portrait. They found a ruler shaped by hostage experience, dynastic violence, and frontier politics. They found evidence of harsh punishments, but also of administrative reforms and resistance strategies. He was neither purely monstrous nor comfortably heroic. He was consistent with the brutal norms of his era, though unusually committed to spectacle as deterrence. The impalements, however numerically debated, were real enough to anchor reputation. Modern Romania approached him with ambivalence and occasional pride, framing him as a defender against Ottoman expansion. International audiences often approached him through the lens of horror fiction. The dual legacy persisted, one grounded in 15th century statecraft, the other in supernatural myth. Time blurred boundaries. Museums displayed artifacts beside vampire memorabilia. Academic conferences analyzed primary sources, while nearby gift shops sold caped figurines. The transformation illustrated how historical memory rarely remained stable. It adapted to cultural needs. Vlad's life had unfolded amid pragmatic calculations of survival between empires. His afterlife unfolded in novels, films, and themed tourism. The distance between those realities was vast, yet both traced back to a prince navigating a precarious throne. In the quiet assessment of historians, he remained a product of his context, unyielding, strategic, and shaped by instability. In popular imagination, he became something nocturnal and immortal. Between those versions stood the documented record, imperfect and incomplete, reminding observers that behind the myth had lived a man whose tools were fear and resolve, not fangs.